We would like to take a moment and thank all our Patreon supporters whose help makes this project possible. Thank you guys, your support is very much appreciated. If you would like to support us, the link to our Patreon page is in the description to this episode. You can also send us a one-time tip via PayPal. My name is Artem, and here is the news. For 405 days, less the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the US announced the allocation of another military aid package for Ukraine worth $2.6 billion, reports European Pravda. The package consists of two parts. The first, worth $2.1 billion, is funded by the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, under which weapons are ordered from manufacturers rather than taken from the stockpiles of the US Armed Forces. These funds will finance additional ammunition for NASAM's air defense systems, 9 30mm anti-drone guns, 10 laser-guided mobile missile systems, 3 air surveillance radar stations, anti-aircraft and artillery munitions, rockets for Grad systems, multiple launch rocket systems and ammunition for them, as well as tank ammunition. Also provided are Javelin anti-tank systems, high-precision aviation munitions, approximately 3,600 small arms and more than 23 million rounds of ammunition for them, 7 tactical vehicles for the evacuation of equipment, 8 heavy fuel tankers and 105 fuel trailers, armored bridge systems, 4 logistic vehicles, trucks and 10 trailers for the transportation of heavy equipment, means of secure communication including satellite, as well as training and funds for the maintenance of the mentioned equipment. The remaining $500 million, which is primarily for munitions, will be spent on equipment from the US Army stockpile. With this package, Ukraine will receive additional ammunition for Patriot anti-aircraft missile systems and HIMARS systems, artillery shells, mortar bombs, tank ammunition, heavy TOW anti-tank guided missiles, approximately 400 grenade launchers and 200,000 rounds for them. In addition, this money will fund 11 tactical equipment evacuation vehicles, 61 heavy fuel tankers, 10 heavy equipment trucks and 10 trailers, vehicle maintenance and repair support equipment, as well as spare parts and other field equipment. In his evening video address, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky thanked President Biden, Congress and every American for the support. Ukrainian crews will soon start training with American M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks, reports European Pravda. According to the CNN source, among high-ranking US defense officials, the Pentagon is still working on purchasing equipment needed for training. The Biden administration announced its intention to send tanks to Ukraine in January. Initially, the United States planned to send Ukraine 31 newer M1A2 Abrams tanks, which could take a year or two to produce and deliver. But in the end of March, Washington decided that Ukraine will receive an older version of Abrams. This is going to speed up their delivery to the Ukrainian military. Romania decided to allocate funds to strengthen the defense capabilities of Ukraine and Moldova, reports Deutsche Welle. In particular, Ukraine will receive more than $800,000 and Moldova $750,000. Funds will be allocated via NATO. A meeting of the Ukraine-NATO Commission took place in Brussels yesterday. The agenda was the support of Ukraine and its opposition to Russian aggression, as well as approaching membership in the alliance, reports Interfax Ukraine. This is the first meeting since 2017, when Hungary consistently blocked the Commission at a level higher than the level of the ambassadors. Opening the meeting, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg assured that the allies will continue to provide support to Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. Stoltenberg stated that NATO allies are already providing significant support, but more is urgently needed. We need to deliver on our pledges of training and new heavy weaponry and continue to ramp up production of weapons and ammunition, the Secretary-General said. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has said that his main message at the meeting was that the Alliance Summit in Vilnius this year was an opportunity to correct the mistakes of the 2008 Bucharest Summit, when Ukraine was denied a prospect of joining NATO. NATO foreign ministers formally supported the development of a multi-year assistance program for Ukraine to help it move closer to NATO, reports Ukrainska Pravda. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stressed that members of NATO remain committed to alliance's open-door policy. Early media reported that the program would include support for Ukraine even after the war with Russia ends. Stoltenberg is also asking member states to allocate 500 million euros a year for the comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, which provides non-lethal assistance supplies to Ukraine. Spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force Yuri Ignat called on the media not to present the transfer of Slovak and Polish MiG aircraft to Ukraine as victorious, reports ICTV. According to him, the transfer of Polish and Slovak MiG-29s aircraft will slightly improve the capacities of the Air Force's fighter aircraft for the implementation of the current combat tasks, but it in no case resolves the issues of the counteroffensive or victory. Ignat stressed that Ukraine needs modern multi-role aircraft with a wide range of weapons in order to gain an edge in the sky and win. 6 civilians were killed and 7 more were wounded in the Russian shelling of Donetsk Oblast, reports Glavred. Residential neighborhoods of several cities were targeted. A mine dispatcher and a nurse were killed in Toretsk, a saleswoman in Krasnohorivka, and 3 residents in the village of Lastochkine in Pokrovsk district, central part of Donetsk region. 7 civilians sustained injuries during the attack on the towns of Bakhmut and Hirnik and the village of Ocheretine. We would really appreciate if you could recommend us to your friends and family, as well as share information on social media. This way more people would learn about the podcast and truth about Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
I am not. I hear somebody else might be, but it's not going to be Jim Stavridis.
That's good. Now, Admiral, I really want to talk to you about 2 stories that have nothing to do with the circus in Lower Manhattan today. The first is that Finland joined NATO, and as the Washington Post puts it, doubling the alliance's land border with Russia. We've talked about this before, but when history looks back, they're going to pay almost no attention to the indictment and a whole bunch of attention to this. Why is this so significant?
First, I cannot agree with you more. This is the story of the day globally in a lot of different ways. And I'll give you 3 reasons it's extremely important, and that they're doing high fives in Brussels, the headquarters of NATO, and over in Moscow, Vladimir Putin is sulking in a corner somewhere. Number one, you already mentioned, 800-mile border that Putin now has to defend. And by the way, the north of that is the Arctic, the high north, which Putin covets. Much harder to make that work with Finland as a member of NATO. Number 2, pure military capability. The Finns, because they have a very aggressive mandatory draft system, because they keep everybody's military skills up at a high level, they can put 300,000 troops in the field in about 90 days. Think of it this way, Hugh. Russia's broken army would be lucky to put 200,000 additional troops in the field. Here comes one nation into NATO with 300,000 troops. And third and finally, history. You don't remember, neither do I, but we know the history of 1939 when Russia, the Soviet Union, invaded Finland. The Finns fought them to a standstill in the Winter War. There's a lot of fighting spirit in Finland directed against Russia. So for all those reasons, it's a really good day for the alliance, Hugh.
Now, on the operational level, I assume that we've been coordinating with Finnish troops and leadership for a long time. What changes on the ground when they're in NATO from when they were friends of NATO?
Yeah, operationally, almost nothing. We have conducted many exercises. I did it as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO a decade ago. My successors have operated with the Finns. The Finns deployed troops under my command into Afghanistan, into the Balkans. They are enthusiastic partners. We are on the ground with them already. What changes is political and diplomatic. Now, if Vladimir Putin were to make a move on Finland, the entire alliance would stand together and push him back. It's a political, diplomatic coup for the alliance. And when you add to it the military capability we just discussed, again, a very big day for NATO.
Now, the guarantee in Article 5, if for any stupid reason Putin were to invade a NATO country, does that mean Finland goes over to the offense immediately?
Indeed, it does. And what will happen, Hugh, is that Finland will now be incorporated in the NATO war plans, all of which, by the way, are defensive in nature, but the entire alliance would stand and fight alongside any member who was invaded. And by the way, I think the target country in NATO, if Putin were ever stupid enough to try and take on the entire alliance, is probably Estonia. Tiny little country right there. A lot of bad history with Russia. So let's say Putin came into Estonia. Now he's got an 800-mile border on his flank to the north that's alive with NATO troops. It just complicates this picture enormously.
That's the good news. Now, I want to talk to you about an article I wrote for the Washington Post over at the landing page this morning on TikTok and artificial intelligence gathering up cloud-generated data that's being stored in the archives of the Chinese Communist Party. When you were running Southern Command or NATO, you had a lot of young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who had devices that they used all the time. When I first asked then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld what he was going to do in the era of blogging before Twitter about the rise of social media, he said he just didn't have enough time. He was running a war to think about that. Have you thought much about what those young sailors, soldiers, Marines, airmen are doing and carrying and whether or not they're fully defensed against information war?
I think about it constantly. And first, just to be on the level here, I'm someone who has long been an advocate for the use of social media, as in to move our messages, democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, gender equality, racial equality. We can use these social media to move those. And by the way, Hugh, my one great mark in military history is that I tweeted the end of a war. I tweeted the end of the war in Libya. That'll go down in military history, announced the end of combat operations. So, point being, I'm an advocate for using social media responsibly. But your point is spot on. In the last 10 years, the opportunities to misuse social media, both by the user, the young soldiers and sailors and airmen, and our opponents to penetrate it over the last 10 years, really over the last 3 years, has gone up exponentially. So, yes, we need to very consciously not only get TikTok off the device of every single member of the Department of Defense for starters, but we've also got to do a better job educating our young military about the dangers of all of these platforms.
Now, coming up after this interview, Admiral, I'm going to talk with former Undersecretary of the Navy and Acting Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Modly. And one of the things I'm going to talk to him about are the Ford class, because there's a lot in his new book, Vectors, about the Ford class. I gather we have four the Ford is underway. We have the JFK not far behind, the Enterprise, and the Doris Miller. Are there going to be more than that?
That's a wonderful question. You ought to ask Tom Modly, who's a smart guy and a deep thinker about all this. My own opinion is that we are probably going to pause by the time that fourth USS Dory Miller gets out the door. I think we're probably going to pause and start thinking about more distributed firepower, but I don't think we're going to go away from large manned platforms. So I think what we're going to end up with is another class of aircraft carrier, but it's going to be smaller so we can build more of them, more affordable, probably not nuclear powered, hugely expensive in terms of personnel manning, and they'll be manned. Instead of manned aircraft, they're going to be unmanned aircraft on these smaller, more distributed, more lethal, kind of around the size of the big deck amphibs, the Iwo Jima size. You should ask Tom Modly what he thinks of that theory.
I'm going to do that, but I'm just curious, do you think the Navy has reconciled itself to that yet?
I think by the time 4 more nuclear carriers come out, and we're talking 15 plus years, I think we will be ready to accept the fact that these big, magnificent, nuclear-powered, 100,000-ton machines of war are still capable, but we need to be lighter, faster, more lethal so we can get closer to our opponents take some losses and move on. And above all, we're going to move to unmanned. And you and I both know very proud Navy fighter pilots. I think it's going to be a kind of a tough one for them to swallow. But particularly as artificial intelligence comes online to drive the maneuverability and capability of these unmanned vehicles, I think it's going to be the right way to go.
One last question, Admiral Stavridis. One of the things that Tom Modley writes about, I always mispronounce it, writes about in Vectors is that during his tenure, Russian submarine activity in the North Sea increased significantly. What does that tell you about getting Sweden into the alliance and Turkey's objections to it?
Yeah, it just staggers me at this point that Turkey is interposing these objections over domestic arguments that concern a Kurdish minority in Turkey. President Erdogan has an election in May. I think that will snap the spell, and we will see Sweden admitted. Your point, all the more important as we see Russian subsurface activity and Russian surface activity operating in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. We need not only Norway, a staunch NATO ally, we need to get Finland, which is up there on that Arctic border as well. They all need to come in. Last thing, and I think this happened on Tom's watch, we reactivated the second fleet, the Atlantic striking fleet, and that is also being increased by NATO. All the more reason to get Sweden into the alliance.
Well, have you made the jump? Bonus question. Have you made the jump from inferring from the Russian infantry and tank catastrophes, and they really have been catastrophic, that their Navy might be in a similar state of disrepair?
I think the right question is certainty and uncertainty here. And we are now certain that the Russian land forces, and it looks like a lot of their air forces, are pretty incompetent. I wouldn't make that leap. We still have to have, at least at this stage, respect for Russia, particularly their submarine force is quite capable. Some of their surface ships have proven more effective than others. I'd really think to myself, Q, the Battle of the Atlantic is going to turn on submarines. Russian submarine forces, from everything I can see and all I can determine talking to my submarine cohort friends, very, very capable. Let's not underestimate them simply because the land forces are as incompetent as they appear to be.
Admiral James Stavridis, always good to talk to you, Admiral. Thank you for joining me this morning. Historic day, Finland in NATO today. It is, and I'm talking to the former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO. Just so you know, there's other news besides the circus in Manhattan, and that news matters a great deal for the next 10, 50, 100 years, for as long as NATO lasts.